Guess what? This is Series 6, Episode 6. If you fast forward to the 6-minute mark, I start projectile vomiting and my head spins 360 degrees. No, it doesn't. The mark of the beast is not real. Theme song. Okay, you probably have heard of active voice and passive voice. If you're watching this, you maybe want to know what the difference is, or your teacher has said, "Why are you using the passive voice so much?" or something like that. So I think we should start with the definition of passive and, no, take a step back. The definition of voice. A lot of people will give you a lot of different definitions of voice, but for our purposes here today, when we're talking passive and active, it has to do with a writer's characteristic style in using verbs. Because when we talk about the passive voice and the active voice, what we're really doing is we're talking about the action in a sentence and how an author is putting that action together. So when you hear somebody say passive and active voice, they're really talking more about passive and active verb constructions. Now, active voice is the one that you use most often naturally. And in your writing, I don't know, 98% of the time, you should really be using active voice. And active voice is kind of what it sounds like. The subject of the sentence does the action. The subject in the sentence is the active part of the sentence, the thing that is active in doing that action verb. And I will give you an example. I made a mistake. Okay? I am the subject. The verb is made. I do that action of making the mistake. But let's be honest with ourselves for a second. How often do people really step up and say, "It was me, I made a mistake"? Not a lot. In fact, one of the most common passive voice sentences is something like, "Mistakes got made." In that case, there's still an action, right? There's something happening to create that mistake, and it's obviously a person who has made that mistake. But using the passive voice allows us to sort of mask who it really was. And so that's what this episode is really going to be about. It's going to be about the times, and there are a few very specific times when you want to say mistakes were made, or some other passive construction where the subject isn't the thing doing the action. All right, the mistake example, probably not the best example to actually start us on a journey. So let's take something that really actually feels active. Let's take a sentence like, "Avery hit the ball." Okay, in that sentence, very clearly we have the subject, Avery, what she did, she hit. We even know what she hit, which was the ball. So we have a subject, we have a very clear action, we have an object that is having that action done to it. If you've studied a lot of English grammar, then you know that the ball in this case is what we call a direct object, but that's not all that important for our discussions today. What is important is we know Avery is the subject, hit is the action verb. Avery hit the ball is a nice active sentence. Now, if you turn that around so that we don't necessarily know at the beginning of the sentence who it is that's hitting the ball, in fact, we could put the ball first, you get a sentence like, "The ball was hit by Avery." So in this case, we are still conveying the information that Avery hit a ball, but we are putting the ball first. And that's what makes it passive. The subject of that sentence, "The ball was hit by Avery," doesn't do the action. The ball is sitting there passive and being acted upon. So hopefully with that example, this distinction is clear in your mind as we get to those reasons why you might want to use the passive voice on purpose. And look, before I enumerate all of these, and I will, it seems like I'm stalling, but I'm not. I just want to be clear that 98, 95% of the time, you really do want to be writing in the active voice. The active voice is zippier, it's got some zazz and some zing to it, and it doesn't sound stuffy and bureaucratic. I mean, there are times when you want to sound smart, but a sentence like "the ball was hit by Avery" doesn't sound smart. Nobody talks like that. Not even the smartest sportscaster in the world. Not you, Marv Albert. Yes, you, Bob Costas. Right, Bob Costas isn't going to say the ball was hit by Avery because that sounds weird. But, okay, what if you didn't know who hit the ball? That's actually reason number one to use the passive voice. When the person or thing that did the action is actually unknown. You might also say mistakes were made if you don't know who it was in the organization that made the mistake. So often that information just isn't there. And when you're writing or when you're speaking and you don't know who performed the action, it is perfectly reasonable and perfectly legitimate to use the passive voice. Now, if you do know who hit the ball and who made the mistake, you really should say so. But maybe you are also in a position where it's important to hide. So it's not that the person is unknown, it's that we don't want it to get out there who it actually was or what it actually was. So that's reason number two. Use the passive voice when you are literally trying to hide the person or the thing that did the action. Now you've got to be careful on this one, because anytime you use the passive voice to hide the subject that actually did the action, it raises a giant red flag. You know, when the communications director for the president stands up at the podium and says, mistakes were made, right? Every reporter in the room is going to go crazy because they want to know. So the passive voice, when you are trying to hide, you're probably not going to get away with it. So it is a reason, but probably not a good one. Number three, the third reason to use the passive voice is when the who did the action actually isn't important. If the press secretary for the president stands up at the podium and says, mistakes were made, and as a result, we are all resigning. Okay, it doesn't really matter who made the mistake. That person is going to be among those who are resigning and out of office. And a lot of times, the passive voice gets used this way for historical things. Like the sentence, Milwaukee was founded in 1846. That's clearly passive. I mean, we know it was Juneau, Byron, and Walker who founded the city back in 1846. But do you need to say that every time you're just giving the date that Milwaukee was founded? No. So number three, when it's not important, who did the action? Reason number four to use the passive voice is when you are consciously making a decision to emphasize the object, the direct object. Thinking back to the Avery hit the ball example, if you feel really bad for the ball, it got dinged up and now it's in ball hospital, you might say, the ball was hit by Avery, because you're trying to create some sympathy. You know, a more true to life example would be something like 6 people were killed by a tornado. The tornado did the action, but people don't care about the tornado, they care about the casualties. So choosing to emphasize the object, a good reason to use the passive voice. Reason number 5, if 95 or 98% of the time you really do want to use the active voice, and it's the other 2 to 5% that you're using the passive voice, I like 0.00001% of the time you would use the passive voice for this reason. And it's a really weird construction where the thing that is the subject in the first part of a sentence with an action verb is the object in the second part of a sentence with an action verb. So there's a sentence that describes something that happened in boxing, which I'm led to believe is a sport. George Foreman beat Michael Moorer but was beaten by Mike Tyson. So in the first half of that sentence, it's a plain old, straight up, active voice sentence. George Foreman beat Michael Moorer. George Foreman did the action, the beating. Michael Moorer is the one who got beat. But in the second half of the sentence, George Foreman switches to the subject, the thing that was beaten. It was Mike Tyson in the second half of the sentence who beat George Foreman. So we switch up the voice of the verb mid-sentence in order to accommodate the fact that George Foreman is in both parts of it. As I said, it's a really rare construction and it's hard to find good examples of it, real examples of it in the wild. It's probably not something you want to spend a lot of time learning to do or thinking about. It's the other four that you should be working on. Okay, yeah, there are these 5 circumstances. I don't know who did the action. I know who did the action. I'm trying to hide it. It's not important who did the action. It's more important to honor the object, or there's this special George Foreman thing. But why can't I, as a teacher, just issue a blanket injunction to you, the student, against using passive voice altogether? Why can't I just say, look, it's already 95 to 98%, make it 100% of the time. You only use the active voice. Well, again, there are times when it's appropriate. And I'm not just talking about Milwaukee was founded in 1846. There are some academic disciplines, and you see this a lot in the sciences, people who publish papers in journals like Nature or the Journal of the American Medical Association or any of those other things that you as a normal person will never actually read. Academic voice is often passive voice, and I'll give you a specific example. Here's a sentence from a study about digital media that I ask students in my AP class to read. This is a sentence. Digital media is increasingly used by children during these early years of brain development. There's an action in that sentence, right? It's using, and it's the digital media that are being used, and it's the children who are doing the using. But the authors here have switched those around. They put digital media first instead of the children. If we were going to write it in an active voice, we would actually just simply say, children in the early years of brain development are increasingly using digital media. And in fact, I bet if these authors were writing for a popular audience, if this was going to get published in the local paper or on a blog post, they would probably use the active voice. But the standard for publishing is to be much more passive, and it especially happens every time a researcher in the paper about their research is talking about what happened, because it is not appropriate in most of those circumstances to use the word I. So even though I, the researcher, conducted this study, the researcher is going to say, a study was conducted of. So you kind of need to know that the passive voice exists. You also need to know that it's necessary, it's mandatory in some cases. So I hope that helps. And I will just one more time, if you're a student in my class, if you're a normal student in anybody's English class, and you're writing about normal English things, use the active voice, okay? I don't want to read a sentence like, a terrible crime was committed by Okonkwo, or the picture of Martha was torn up and thrown away by Lieutenant Jimmy Cross. No, put Okonkwo first, put Jimmy Cross first. I mean, that's the way it needs to be written. So, there's one more episode left in this series about sentences and some syntax things that we haven't gotten to before. I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be the only series so far that has a 7th episode. I'm pretty stoked about that. So I will see you for the next one. But then in the second sentence, Mike Tyson is the one. I said Michael. Why would I say Michael? Everybody knows he's not Michael.